Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Ardian, thank you very much, and good afternoon and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you this afternoon about some of the perspectives of ISO 27001 and certification against it that I've learned over the years. And I'm going to be approaching it from a relying party's perspective. And relying party may be something that you may not be familiar with, but it's a term that I use frequently when I'm discussing information security and the rights and obligations on one party to another. So this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about, to give you 5 perspectives that will hopefully show, first of all, what and who a relying party is, and why their perspective is so important when you consider an entity's or your own journey through ISO 27001. The second objective I really want to get out of this is from these perspectives is how the relying party can state their security requirements to allow service providers to demonstrate that their own 27001 conformance, and also allow them to demonstrate how they protect the relying party's data. The third objective is really is the difficult one, which is always how do you assess the evidence that people are presenting to make sure that their assurances and evidence they provide by 27001 are going to meet your objectives for protecting your data. And finally, I want to share some experience I've had in the last 6 or 7 months about taking a very small service provider through their own ISO 27001 processes to become conformant, to provide security assurances to their clients. And in that capacity, I've been acting not as the relying party, but actually the deliverer of an information security management system that is 27001 compliant. And I've learned some interesting experiences about being on the other side of the 27001 equation. But before I start that, I give you some insights as to who I am. I spent 29 years in the British Army in the Royal Corps of Signals, and for those who know what the Royal Corps of Signals is, it's the branch of the British Army that deals with communications. And in the latter stages of my career, I assumed responsibility for the UK Ministry of Defence's in-house information security consultancy and its information security research program. Now, as part of that, and we're going back to the late 90s here, this was a time which predated 27001 and its predecessor, whatever it was, I think it was 177791, and its previous British standard. And a lot of the work that we came out with during that research program and some of the standards and policies we developed in the Ministry of Defence at that time directly fed into some of the foundations of the information security management system that we currently find in 27001. So I've got some significant experience going back over a long period about how one generates an information security management system to provide evidence to parties that you are sufficiently secure. Well, I retired in 2001. I went to APAX. You may not be familiar with that acronym. It is the Association for Payment and Clearing Services. It's a bank trade association, which was a cooperative venture, an activity where the banks collaborated on a wide variety of technical issues to do with payments, from allowing payments received from one bank to a payment clearinghouse, for example, and also a lot of cooperative aspects about how one secures those environments, and some common services and common experiences that the banking industry faced. And one of the particular ones I was addressing in about 2004 to 5 was the whole scourge of e-banking fraud and internet anonymity. I left there in about 2010, and I moved across to Visa Europe, where I became the Vice President for Payment System Risk. And there I moved into a completely different standard arena, where I became responsible for how we in Visa Europe applied PCI, the payment card industry security standards, to gain assurance from the participants in the payment system that they met the risk appetite that we wanted to protect cardholder data and cards when and however they were used or even manufactured within the European environment. I then went to become the Regional Information Security Officer for Castle Morgan Lee, where I was responsible for implementing their European cyber risk and assurance strategy. And a significant component of that was actually providing assurance to our clients and customers that we were protecting their business travelers' personal information in a way that was appropriate and reasonably responsible, and that our systems were sufficiently secure. And for the last 18 months or so, nearly 2 years now, I've been independent, where I've been providing this sort of guidance and information to a wide variety of clients in the merchant sector, the service provider space, and as you'll hear later, in the case of providing direct guidance to some startups to how they can evidence their security to their client base and customer base. So I've got a significant experience over the years in thinking about information security, and particularly about how one presents assurances to third parties that one is sufficiently secure, particularly when one is providing services from one party to another, which is a major thrust of the presentation that I'm going to be talking about. So the 5 perspectives I want to offer through this webinar, and I've broken the webinar into these 5 individual perspectives, is first of all to really address this issue of who and what is a relying party. And why is security insurance, and hence 27001, so important for the relying party to gain confidence that the other party is sufficiently secure. And I know we're talking about 27001 here. 27001 is an important way of evidencing how secure you are, but it's not the only game in town. And we need to be honest about recognizing what other methods exist and what they can and what they cannot offer, and how one might choose one method over another. The third perspective is this is where it really the rubber starts to hit the road, which is trying to establish how one forms a baseline between the relying party and their supplier or suppliers. And particularly, do we really both agree on the level of sensitivity of the data we are protecting, and hence the control frameworks that we're implementing to protect that data? The fourth perspective is really how you go about assessing that evidence, and what sort of things I learned in the past about how one makes judgments about not just has the customer or the supplier got the 27001 certificate on the door, not only are they doing the processes, but what else does that show you about their ability to protect the data or provide systems that you as the relying party are relying upon. And finally, I want to share my perspectives of actually doing it. I've not only been promoting 27001, I've actually been, apologies. I think my window's paused a moment. Ardian, can you see my screen all right?
Yes, Colin, I can see your screen.
Thank you very much indeed. Yep. So I want to share some experience about how small service providers should use ISO 27001 to provide assurance to their relying parties. I think that is important. The ability for small providers to operate in this space, I think, is important. Okay, so let me go on and address the first issue that I want to address, which is really about, pardon me, going the wrong way, who and what is a relying party? And therefore, why is security assurance so important to them? Relying party may not be a term that you're familiar with. It's a term that was originally coined in the concept of PKI. It was established as the concept of how one relied on the trust in other people's certificates, PKI certificates delivered under the X509 standard. How you as a relying party made some judgment about the assertions people were making about security policies that underpin the issuance of that certificate to whoever's using it to make some form of assertion. Now, I found that concept of describing who a relying party was and what they were doing was really quite powerful. And I started to use that term when I was at Visa Europe, particularly to describe the complex trust relationships that exist in the card payment ecosystem. And it doesn't matter whether you're Visa Europe or Visa or MasterCard or Amex, this chain of trust that exists is important. And trying to identify who these relying parties are in that equation are very, very important. Which is why, I started to explain the fact that we, as the card schemes when I was there, we relied on the acquirers reporting reasonably and accurately the compliance of their merchants. And equally, the acquirers were relying upon their merchants to report on their security and implement the PCI DSS controls to protect cardholder data in a reasonable, responsible way. But equally, the merchants were the relying parties of the PCI SAC delivering products and security standards and assessment capabilities that they could then assess against the standard. And this whole concept of making sure you identify who is relying upon whom is actually very important when you're identifying where the trade-offs exist in information security. Okay, well, so where does this new reality come from? Part of it comes from this whole concept of cyberspace where we are now, and I purloined some definitions of what cyberspace is, and I think it comes from the whole world of what we now consider cybersecurity, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But this whole concept of a cyberspace being a complex environment where lots of interactions, lots of people, lots of software and services are now existing and communicating across the internet. And if anyone's never looked at the internet map, it is a wonderfully rich experience to understand the complexity of how entities relate to each other in a non-physical form and don't exist in any physical idea. And some of the issues that we now have from and some of the new descriptions of cybersecurity are becoming very, very important. Yeah, the cybersecurity is really pushing forward the barriers and understanding of how we're interconnected. And I'm not a great fan of the concept of cybersecurity, and I won't bore you with why that is the case. But there's some important facets about cybersecurity I think are important in this discussion. It describes an environment and actors. It defines new assets and consequences. Importantly, cybersecurity definitions do explain the importance of roles and responsibilities. Also, from my perspective, interestingly and importantly, consumers. But the whole concept of is really that this environment has a usefulness for everyone, and everyone has rights and responsibilities and have to take an active role in what they're doing. And importantly, it also talks about being risk management important and being a much bigger issue than we ever thought. But this whole concept of cybersecurity and cyberspace about one entity connecting to another and providing services is so very, very important these days. And recently, we've seen some of the consequences. I lived and breathed the climate card industry for at least 4.5, 5 years in my time at Visa Europe and before. And I think we're all familiar with the concept of the consequences of data breaches. I think one of the most significant data breaches in the public domain was the data breach at Target, or Target as they call it in the US, where in order to gain access to credit card data in Target's systems, the attackers targeted the HVAC company, and that may be an abbreviation you may not be familiar with. It stands for Heating, Ventilation, Air Conditioning Company. There was a service provider who was operating all of the heating, ventilation, and all those systems within the Target stores, and they were accessing the systems remotely, and therefore they had access into Target's network within the individual retail establishments throughout the United States. And the hackers broke into that company and then piggyback from there into Target to put malware on there and record and capture cardholder data. And the question here is how do you make any judgment about what and who you're interconnecting to, and how do you, and what assurances do you require now and in the future that these people who are connecting to your systems, even if they don't appear to be mission critical systems, are sufficiently secure to protect your environment and your systems and the data they're processing. And this level of interconnectivity is becoming quite considered, which is why relying parties are important to consider. And the other dimension I'd add to this is that because of cybersecurity and the issues about how information systems are so all-pervasive out there, regulators and government entities are now becoming a relying party in their own right. They're expressing through their regulations and the requirements in those regulations the obligations of people to do certain things in the way they protect information and data on behalf of society as a whole. So they are becoming society's relying parties. We see that through GDPR about the recommendations for what constitutes best-of-the-art, state-of-the-art will be determined by the General European Data Protection Board. Under the Network and Information Security Directive coming out of the Commission, out of Europe, it's encouraging the use of standards and specifications, but the Commission will draw up the list of those standards. So it's defining what it is best practice out there and establishing the framework that people test against. In my primary industry at the moment, which is payments and banking and all those sorts of things, Payment Service Directive 2, PSD2, is also stating those sorts of things about the protection of payment systems, which have also led through other pieces of work to devise a thing called the Regulatory Technology Standards, which also defines particular security measures that have to be documented, tested, evaluated, and audited by internal or external independent and qualified auditors. In other words, the whole thrust of these directives is saying, we are the relying party, you have to prove to us and evidence it by using appropriate standards and assessment methods that you are sufficiently secure. So in summary, the thing I would say about relying parties is that the first thing is that the descriptions of cybersecurity and cyberspace provide real compelling evidence these days that we all rely upon each other in one form or another. And we find relying parties where there is a connectivity between partners and where people start to consume any form of IT service or service provision from any sort of supplier. And I think we have to really recognize that these days, even the regulators can be considered to be society's relying party in a very important sense. And finally, I think we recognize through Target and other data breaches that have happened and continue to happen, there's continuing and compelling evidence of the level of harm that can come when a relying party fails to seek assurance or inappropriate assurance from its suppliers that they are sufficiently secure. So what type of evidence are available? Which is the second perspective I was going to give you. Well, the first thing is there are a large variety of methods out there. You have internal schemes, which I'm not going to worry about at the moment, the internal audit or community-based schemes within selective entities, and some maybe contractual obligations that have to fill. And then there are external service schemes where you can either have standards or frameworks which you can assess security against or auditing against those. And I've put a flavor of them down there, ranging at the one end from the successors to SAS 70, ISA 3402 and SSA 16, through 27001, all the way down to PCI standards, which are themselves external schemes which people have to comply with, through to the more arcane ones, which unfortunately in my view may not have got as much traction as it needs, which is the System Security Engineering Capability Maturity Model, which provides some metric for security engineering practices and particularly the repeatability of practices. And there's a number of ones in the middle there. Those who may not be familiar with the T-scheme is one that the UK produced as a co-regulatory standard to develop assurance of PKI implementations. And it uses as its basis ISO 27001 as the metric for defining security requirements and how one audits against those. So it's broadly aligned with 27001 in many specific areas, but targeted at PKI implementations. So there's a variety of methods you can choose. But if you're a relying party, you've got to understand what properties you want to get from a security assurance method. And there are a variety of things that you might want to look for. The first one is that you want to look at to determine whether the process is sufficiently open and transparent and independent of any industry. Really, you want to make sure in that sense that you're not beholden to a vested interest in some senses that is trying to define a particular method in a certain way. And that gets a bit difficult with the card payment industry, but I can explain where PCI fits in that space and is sufficiently open and transparent for the variety of protecting data in the card payment industry. It's also got to have some credibility as a good method, and it's got to have some sort of litmus test of people liking it, using it, and relying upon it. And it's got to, people have therefore got to appreciate what it means by the number of entities and service providers who actually use that to provide evidence to each other that they are sufficiently secure. And it's also clearly going to be fit for the purpose. We really got to make sure that we want to use a method that is actually going to deliver something, method of assurance, to what the customer really needs in the first place. So, for example, you are unlikely to use FIPS 140, which is a very much hardware-orientated standard for analyzing cryptographic methods and cryptographic solutions for some system-level implementation to do with data processing. So you've got to choose the right method to express what it is you're trying to do. And importantly, and it's got to be repeatable and give consistent and transferable results. And some standards where have particularly rigorous frameworks with particularly rigorous control objectives and very narrowly defined, like PCI data security standard, do give repeatable and consistent results. With ISO 27001, sometimes that can be a little bit more challenging because of a variety of things that I'll explain later on. And clearly they've got to be achievable. The last thing you want to do is apply a standard or a process or request a security method of your party who's providing you services that they cannot ever achieve and satisfy. It's got to be achievable, and it's got to demonstrate and be fit for purpose for what you want to achieve. And you as the relying party, you've got to be able to review the results of the assurance method to give you confidence. So whatever results are generated, you have to be able to read and understand and express. Okay. So some of the questions that have to be asked about making a decision about what method you're doing. So, and I'm trying to apply these questions that I would ask and therefore work out which standard would apply in which case or which method I would use. The first question is, if it's important for external assessment on people doing what they say they're doing, then certainly ISA 3402 and SSA 16 are very good. A lot of relying parties actually come and ask entities for that because of the litmus test of what those provide. If you want to assess against an independent security framework rather than the security framework that the customer is going to generate or the supplier is going to generate, as in the case with 3402 and SSA 16, then you're really looking at something that has a framework that's included, embodied with the standard. 27001 has one, PCI standards have those, T-Scheme and Common Criteria have similar sorts of frameworks associated with them. When you're looking at solutions that give the various suppliers a wider variety of implementation design choices, in other words, you are liberating people from the specific controls that are required, then you're really looking at 27001, T-Scheme, 3402, and so on, and Common Criteria. PCI DSS is less amenable in that space because there is a certain presumption that you are processing card data, and there are certain controls that are important to protect card holder data, such as encryption and so on. If you've got a common architectural model, however, like processing card payment data, in other words, you're a merchant, and merchants do a similar sort of thing in a similar sort of ways because they have similar sort of systems out there, then that's where PCI security standards become so important, because it is cookie cuttering a variety of technical implementations and architectural configurations the same way in UK, in France, Germany, Malaysia, Australia, wherever you might be, and therefore applying a common global standard designed for that environment is very, very important. If you really want to try and understand the overall leadership, culture, and attitude to security in your customers or your suppliers who are providing you services, then really 27001 and 3402 and SSA 16 are where you really need to be looking for, because the key to implementing those sorts of evidence and those sorts of frameworks in place you really require that level of leadership and cultural commitment to act within an organization to be able to evidence the answers. If you've got lots of people offering services out there against a lot of frameworks, like for example developing devices for accepting hardware devices for accepting card payments from a lot of different manufacturers, then again PCI security standards are some of the best ones to look at, because those standards become highly tuned to the marketplace in which they're delivering them. Importantly, if you want a particular level of assurance that some security controls have been implemented in a particular way to a particular strength, then the only standard you got out there is for common criteria, which talks about certain evaluation assurance levels ranging from 1 to 7. But if you've got a community which is expecting a certain benchmark, that's when 27001 or PCI standards come into play, because the community generally broadly accepts those sort of solutions. I want to run you about how you might use these assurance selection questions in an environment. And this is a piece of exercise that I did several years ago when I was working within APACS, the Association for Payment Clearing Services, and how we were leveraging our own internal Card Protection Agency accreditation scheme. And now in order to do this, I have to explain what the business model is. You can't really get a grip of why we were in this sort of space unless you understand the problem domain. And this was a problem domain that existed, we're talking about more specifically about 10 years ago now. So the card protection business model is this. In the first place, you have card issuers who issue cards to cardholders. And there are many card issuers and there are many cardholders. And you know, I think the average card issuance or card holding of a cardholder is many cardholders have 3 or 4 different cards in their wallets, up to many people have up to 10 different cards in their wallets. And the key issue is what happens when they lose their wallet containing all of their cards. And the card protection business model was all about providing a framework which would allow them to go to one reporting point, and that one reporting point would report to all card issuers that that cardholder had lost all their cards. So in order to do that, the cardholders would register their card with what we call a card protection agency, and there are a number in the marketplace, and still are, where they would actually go and fill out a form, or web-based form or some form, listing all their card issuance and the card numbers in order to allow the card protection agency to handle what would happen if they ever lost the card. If the cardholder lost the card, all they would do is to report the loss to the one reporting point, their card protection agency. The card protection agency then would report that loss to each of the card issuers, which were for the cards that registered their environment. And eventually the card issuers would issue a new card to the cardholder. Now, because we were in a many-to-many space here, there were many card issuers and there were several card protection agencies. It was inappropriate from an economy of effort and resourcing perspective for every single card issuer to accredit and register every single card protection agency. So we within APACS managed a program which would look at the card protection agencies to check that their fidelity and quality of purpose for protecting this very important data that they had on trust. And one of the important things we had to establish was to make sure that we understood how they were, whether the card protection agencies knew what they were protecting, why it was valuable, and what would threaten it, and how. And we were in our program, but the in-house program was becoming really difficult to maintain. It was a major commitment and time on effort, and it was becoming increasingly expensive to resource and maintain the currency of that program and the relevance of the program. You know, if you looked at the standard that we were asking people to follow, it was very much like a lot of other security standards, and it became the question about whether we were the right and appropriate people to maintain the standard in that domain within APACS. And you know, this was really a data warehousing problem. It was rich with IT and IC security issues. And we had a number of these card protection agencies, and we wanted to assess them against a common representational framework. And we recognized also that one of the things we had to address was that across all these card protection agencies, they all implemented their solutions in different ways. There was no rigorous format. They had different methods of encryption, different solutions for accepting the data, and so on, to meet their business model, and also to tie into the other processes and practices they offered. Now, for the purposes of the industry and for our relying parties, which was our card issuers, and in fact the card best practices assurance method that we could gain some trust about. And importantly, there were a number of these card protection agencies that we needed to improve the quality of security they were offering. In other words, we needed to change the culture and mindset of the number of the existing participants. A method. So we chose 27001. We wanted a best-of-breed assurance method that provided external evidence to us of the entity's leadership and commitment to security. And that was the key component. And we also wanted something that wouldn't dictate the solution on them. We didn't be responsible for the design of their systems. We wanted them to design how they were going to do it, and we wanted to check the security of their security management system and the risks and checks and balances within that environment. And we really wanted to allow them to use a variety of methods, and we weren't really saying how you actually applied this and how you use other methods to provide security and assurance to other relying parties. So we really latched on to 27001 as the way of actually providing those sorts of controls, and that's why it became important to us. So the next important question and next perspective I wanted to give, which actually follows on naturally from that, was the importance of establishing the baseline between the relying party, me, the customer of the services, or the person accepting services from the supplier, and how we all agreed the sensitivity of the data we're protecting. And as I will see later on, I will reference back to my experience from establishing the choice of 27001 in that domain. We're all familiar with these diagrams which expose how one assesses and implements an information security management system. And I like this diagram. It's a little bit more than the plan, do, check, act cycle that exists within 27001, but it's the same sort of idea. But the importance about defining it, the model this way, is that I try to identify that there are different vulnerabilities and there are different assets and there are different threats existing, and each of these cogs are working at different times at different levels. And importantly, you know, the asset description and how you describe that is really quite important in developing your risk management structure within any enterprise, and to making sure how importantly, you know, when your entity's 27,000 customer, how do you know they've assessed the risk the same way as you would? I mean, you're asking them to protect some data that you don't want to process yourself, or you're asking some supplier to do that on your behalf. So the question is, how do you establish a baseline where you can all agree that you're looking things at the same way? Now, if you remember what I was saying about the Card Protection Agency business, you know, we had a number of suppliers in that domain. There were 3 or 4 different card protection agencies, all coming up with slightly different strategies, and they were all being assessed against 27001, and they all had their own risk management processes within those organizations. So we needed to establish a baseline. So there's various ways to do it. You can conduct a supplier assurance review. You can review their security framework and policy and all those other things. You can work out how they classify the assets, have they got under trust, what assets, what threats are they considered, and yeah, are they consistent with how you would think about this problem domain? And yeah, but the question is, how does it all change when you've got multiple suppliers you're comparing like with like with? In our case, we had this community assurance program. We had these many providers of services, very different implementation strategies. We had many relying parties, and we really had to ask, how would we use 27001 across this community to get what we wanted? Well, we established a overarching program, which we said, first of all, okay, we want you to do 27001. Or at the time there were some other solutions available than 27001, and we assessed certain equivalents that would be capable of giving us the same sort of assurance. We wanted them to submit their evaluators report to us, to the community, at APAX for our accreditation, so we could review the report and make sure we understood what was being assessed. We had certain non-27,000 requirements about the availability of the service to the service holder, because if you're running this sort of service, we wanted to make sure that their response to a cardholder who'd lost his wallet was sufficient to meet the industry's requirements. And importantly, we wanted them to accept a community view of what the threats were like. And this is one of the most important lessons we learned, was the establishing across this community of providers, and it went eventually beyond those providers for those systems to other services out there, that we wanted everyone to accept that we had a certain perspective of the threat, and if the threat did exist, we wanted you to take our threat assessment and incorporate it within your own service provider risk assessment method. And I want to share with you some thoughts about the community threat assessment we generated. It was a generic document which we provided as a service to our entities who we were expecting to be 27,001 sets. Well, the threat assessment was broken into two components. There was an asset component and a threat component. We wanted to make sure that everyone understood what assets they were holding on trust by description, and also what the consequences of compromise were to those assets, therefore why we thought those assets were so important to the industry. And then secondly, we talked about the threat component in the assessment. In other words, who were the sources, who were the threat actors who would try and gain access to the data in order to commit to gain some sort of value or some benefit from gaining access to those assets. And then finally, we described the various attack methods that would be that we saw being used to attack those sorts of sources, data assets, by those sorts of attack actors, threat actors in the real world. And importantly, throughout this threat assessment, we capitalized on open source information to actually provide a rich background and tapestry to describe why these assets were so important, what the consequences of compromise were, who the threat actors were, and the evidence of the attack method, so that people were under no illusion that this was a threat assessment based on a common understanding of the issues out there. I'll show you a couple of thoughts from the assessment. We defined threat severities in it, low, medium, and high for a variety of threat actors. In other words, the likelihood by which they would prosecute any form of attack against that data asset. We in the attack methods, these generic categories, and here is the one we described about what electronic attack was, so that we could have some confidence that people would design controls to prevent electronic attack against the assets we were concerned about. And as you can see, we linked and provide evidence through footnotes of evidence we'd seen against attacks and capabilities that might be used or assets that might be under harm. And at the back, we showed a full open source threat reference of all the specific stories and issues that we saw, which provided compelling evidence that these were real threats, real assets, real threat actors that were going to concern our industry. And it was an important baseline to establish the fact that the risk assessments and then the designs that were going to be implemented to those risk assessments and the information security management systems that were going to maintain the protection of those assets through 27,001 were all done from a common baseline. We learned from applying this baseline that, really importantly, that this threat appreciation in the community base was absolutely critical. And I can see compelling evidence by which, having learned through that experience, that if I were a relying party again and I was in this sort of domain, that any of my service providers, I would try and provide them my threat appreciation so that they understood what I was concerned about in providing services to me, the relying party. And I also think that supplier assurance reviews, which many people do, they call them vendor assurance reviews, are important to conduct, but they only go so far. The things that 27,001 gives you, the ability to engage with people by establishing this common baseline, overcome some of the problems of supplier assurance reviews, which in my experience do become very formulaic and very predictable. One of the important aspects about this baseline was that the openness and transparency by which you engage with people was absolutely essential. We're trying to gain assurance from the suppliers that they're secure enough. They want to get some assurance from us, in one sense, that we know what we want them to do and what we want them to protect. And the establishing this baseline, the communicating this baseline in an open, transparent manner was really critical, to making sure that you get what you want from your customer, from your supplier, and what he can present as evidence through his 27001 process. So let's move on to the next perspective, is how one relies upon the evidence, how one assesses the evidence one is provided. And importantly, I think I'm going to make this right up front. It's not just about reviewing simple things like the certificate or capability. Everyone I know will say when they talk about 27001, well, it all depends on what the scope of applicability was and what the assessment was against. We've all heard horror stories about people claiming to be 27001 compliant when it's only really the laptop that's locked up in the cupboard somewhere. I'm not sure that is true. I'm pretty sure that is, broadly speaking, anecdotal and not borne out by the quality of this and the depth of some of the assessments we see. I think some of the other elements we need to look at are also the assessment report. We need to, at times, look at the actual document set that the entity is offering as well, so we can make our own judgment about whether the risk assessment is being conducted across the things that we want it to be assessed. And importantly, we want to get evidence from the entity's people who were asking us to provide these services, who were the relying party of, to really actually gain some confidence that we know what they're looking at. So in more detail, what we're saying is that, first of all, is their scope, or their scope of applicability, your scope? Are they covering things that you would be concerned about? And do they protect the assets as if they were your own? It's a question of, you're giving them, particularly when service providers, when they provide some data warehousing or provide some services to you, where you're putting your data, particularly personal data, over in their environment, or in my past experience, cuddle data over in their environment. Do they understand that they're protecting that data as if it were their own data that they're protecting? And now they're taking the same sort of judgments that you would want them to take. And you've also got to be comfortable with their security design. You don't dictate their security design, but you really need to be comfortable that the security design is doing something that you think is important within the context of the risks they've identified. The next thing I would look for as a relying party is, what did the assessor report on? Now, clearly issues like non-conformities, work in progress, remediation strategies, and everything else they're doing else. But it's not just what did he find, it's what are they doing about it. One of the important considerations was the degree to which you can engage with the supplier to make sure that they're comfortable about talking about what was found, why it was found, and what they're doing about it in the future. That gives you confidence that their plan, do, check, act cycle is working effectively. You want to understand who owns the ISO 27000 assessment. I mean, the important thing about ISO 27001 is not a compliance vehicle in of its own right. It's a culture. It's an information security management system that's bedded within the organization. And you really want to try and who owns it. If IT own it, then, well, okay, but why do IT own it and not the board? I mean, this is a leadership issue. It's a measure of leadership commitment within the organization to being assessed. And therefore, decisions about investment to satisfy the requirements of why you're being, the protection of the information you've got under trust is actually really very, very important indeed. And therefore, that leadership commitment can surely come from the board or chief executive or someone in a very senior position who's making that commitment to protect the data. And really, what do they say about their 27001 certification? I can say to you that when we were running this program in APACs against the car protection agencies, one of the most amazing things was the level of pride with which many of these car protection agencies really felt about achieving 27001 certification and what it meant to them as a company about showing what they did and how they did it. And even to the extent of reporting earlier on for listed companies on the stock exchange, they were including details about what they'd accomplished and how they'd accomplished within their annual reports as a measure of their commitment to protecting data. And I think that was a very important level of evidence that one would sort to look for. They're willing to commit and provide their source documents, their policies, their framework, their strategies, their ability to discuss issues and strategies. And as I said, is it reported in the annual company report? One of the really important things I've found in the past is it's not just about looking at source material and actually looking stuff on the web or tracking the certificate down and following those sorts of things. It's actually engaging with your partner in a face-to-face domain and actually talking about those sorts of issues, about all these issues in a face-to-face, understanding what the people are thinking in a minute-to-minute basis. And I've put together a possible agenda here that one would develop on a regular basis, perhaps annually or even 6-monthly intervals, to talk with your supplier, particularly if it was a critical supplier. The first thing would be to establish background and context for the regular meetings and truly getting to grips with understanding the importance of ISO 27001 to you as the relying party and what they felt within their own organization of its importance to them. To get a grips with how they're managing their ISMS and particularly how it's changing over time. No ISMS was staying static for long periods. It's all about change and how these things change over time. And thirdly, it's about how they deliver those things. What changes they're making, what improvements they're making. Have there been any incidents that they want to talk about and express on what they're trying to do and how they remediated those within their information security management system, and what significant external threat and vulnerability issues they've dealt with and how they've dealt with them. So just about how one actually, as a relying party, one would go about this. In the end, you as a relying party are always responsible. You can't get rid of that responsibility for your own data, even use a service provider. Lots of people try to, but you've got to maintain that relationship to understand what they're providing you and how they're doing it. You can't dictate the security design necessarily to an entity under 27001, but you've got to be comfortable with it. And the level of effort you apply has to be proportionate to managing that relationship to the number of suppliers and the sensitivity of the data they're providing. And I do think it's really important, and I can't stress this enough, to engage bilaterally with your most important suppliers. Get to know them face-to-face and understand what they're providing. Okay, I'd like to summarize at the end with some observations about using 27001 for small parties. Let me the organization I'm talking about, and I provided the pictures here on it. I'm very proud to work with this company. They're very innovative ideas about providing a bioinformatics platform for research and development in respect of drugs, the use of the genome, and a whole variety of issues out there. Small company, lots of very professional people. They rely on open source products throughout what they're doing, and they've hosted the environment in their AWS, which brings into scope the whole of the AWS hosted responsibility model and their ability to respond and release new products into that environment because they're highly adaptive. And from our perspective, from Genestack's perspective, yeah, it's a really quite sensitive IPR data stored within the environment and potentially health information as well, depending on what the research sector are doing. So we have to respond to that. So there's really significant expectations of our clients and the security of the platform. And importantly, in our environment, clients develop their own code to execute their own computationally intensive tasks within our environment, within AWS, and some of those tasks have a long duration. So it's a really quite exciting environment to be actually involved with. And I had to come along and actually try and make ISO 27000 fit what is a relatively small organization. The first thing was I had to get the basics right. I had to understand the security requirements, the framework, and document the security features which are inherent within the design itself. Because when you got a small company developing solutions in AWS, you're making certain design assumptions up front about what it is you're trying to protect. Documenting that security design is important. And simplifying the document set was really critical to us to make sure it was work. We also had to, from an information security management system, exploit what was available. As you'll see in a moment, we use Google Forms really in an exciting way. We use Google Drive for document management system, and our ticketing system was really excellent for understanding how we handled and responded to incidents. And the staff's commitment was outstanding. The chief executive's commitment to security and the ability to make security simple and part of everyone's day-to-day work activity has really been quite important aspect. And of course, when you get small staff, the whole issue of training and guidance to members of staff becomes a lot more tractable, because I can engage with 30 members of staff on a one-to-one basis to provide them specific hands-on guidance. So one of the first things I did was simplify the ISMS framework. I've actually simplified the document set into a way that we can manage and supports the way we're working. There are policy documents which will be long-standing. There are operations document which explains how we do things, and there are various business agreements which define our relationships with our relying parties, which are our customers and clients, and the people who we rely upon, which is in our case AWS and a number of other service providers as well. I'd like to explain some of the tools we use to actually show the information security management system that we implemented. And here, Google Forms, I can't speak too highly of it. One of the things you want to do in an information security management system is to improve accountability. And really, that's tracking when people did things and do they do what we're saying. And I've shown you a simple example here on acknowledging the AUP. So we simply created a Google form with AUP. And the nice thing about Google Forms is that you can actually represent the results of all the responses in a spreadsheet. You haven't got to create new forms, new accountabilities. It's all documented and captured when people respond to that thing. And we're using Google Forms for our management processes like access control reviews. We're using it for security training and awareness training, and a variety of other methods and processes that the company is already using, which can actually record when certain things are taking place. The other really powerful solution that we've got in place is that we have a ticket management system. Everyone has a ticket management system, one for another. But we've used the ticket management system ruthlessly to manage incidents and the work we're doing on security. Many of you all have heard about the AWS issue when it fell over in February. There was an outage on S3 in the US, in the Northeast region. It was an incident for us. We had to assess it and apply it. So we've included all that within our ticket management system. And as you go through the ticket management system, it covers off all the issues about how one responded to it. I can't show all of it here clearly, but it goes through and shows how each individual responded, how we finally as a security working group assessed the consequences of the incidents, and how we reported it to senior management. And the other of our solution, fortunately, is we have a wiki associated with it, so we can actually tailor documents within the wiki, which all the staff use for all their normal working engineering and data management perspectives in a way that actually tells a story to them. And we've tailored a lot of the user-orientated material in a way of an FAQ, because it's the sort of questions that they would ask, and therefore what their role and responsibilities are in that domain. So some of the things I learned, really, 27,000 for a start does work for small enterprises, which I'm surprised at. I surprised myself, and I think it surprised a lot of people that it can work effectively in those sorts of environments. But you've got to tailor it. You've got to make your 27,000 ISMS work the way the enterprise actually works. And really critical to this is actually understanding the technical and security design that you're providing your clients and building your environment ISMS around that design and how you're implementing that design going forward. It really does, even for small enterprises. I am surprised at the degree to which implementing the ISMS has really helped a small organization understand risk in ways that are really quite profound to its business and work out what future opportunities exist in promoting its solutions to its customers. And importantly, the third point is this point about using what capabilities the company already uses and making security management work the way the enterprise works. Don't force security management on the organization. Make the security management work the way they already work and building the accountability and recording to all the processes that they have in place. And I apologize for the hiccup earlier on when I had my Skype operating when it caused me to have a little panic attack there. I hope I've given you an example through this of 5 perspectives that would show, first of all, why a relying party is so important, how they can, from their perspective, consider in their journey for 27001 reliance from their suppliers, and how a supplier can represent their 27000 insurance to their customers. Importantly, how a relying party can state security requirements through things like community or specific threat appreciations that they want their 27001 conformance supplier to respond to in a more active way. I hope I've shown you some ideas, given you some ideas about how to assess the evidence in order to meet the needs of service providers and their needs. And finally, give you insights on my experience over the last 6 to 7 months of taking a very small organization through 27001 and actually define my own expectation as to how 27001 would reasonably apply to a small organization and prove incredible benefits in helping them be more risk aware, manage the security that they're providing in a really effective and responsible way within the way they work. Now, before I close out and take a couple of questions, there's some questions come up that I will try and answer. I'll hand you back to RJ, and he'll describe some of your 27001's training courses that PECB offer.
Thank you, Colin, for delivering this very informative presentation. We want to inform you that PECB provides training and certification services for 27001 Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, and Lead Auditor. The training is designed to provide you the required knowledge to carry out audits of information security management system against ISO 27001 and be able to run the processes involved in implementing ISMS as defined in the standard. A PCB certificate will exemplify your dedication in implementing and managing these processes and frameworks, and also most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now we will go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees regarding today's topic. The first question is it easier for small service providers or for large ones to implement the ISO 27001, or for which one is more beneficiary?
I think I hope to answer that with my last comment. I mean, most people expect 27001 to be applicable to larger organizations, and it very much is. And from an ISMS perspective and building security within the governance of the organization, I think it's important. But I think I certainly learnt myself, and I think that I hope I demonstrated today that even small organizations, if they tailor the ISMS appropriately and understand what it is they're trying to achieve, can use 27001 effectively to provide assurances that they are secure.
Thank you, Colin. Now the second question is concerning the external body. What are the consultants doing to make sure that organizations are living the standard rather than tidying loopholes every time for the purpose of the recertification? Example is PCI-DSS. I believe that a random snap check will assist.
I think it's a very good question, that one, which is why I made the point of having bilateral engagement with your supplier regularly. In other words, you asking questions of them and making sure that you understand the culture of the organization is effectively doing what the question is asking, whether they're both not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk as well, as our American colleagues would say. And you can only get that sort of level of responsiveness by engaging sufficiently frequently with your supplier in order to understand how they're managing and responding to their ISMS and what it's doing for them on a day-to-day basis. And these questions that I asked and identified about asking them to talk about incidents that they've seen and how they responded to them and what it's meant to them, how they've responded to new vulnerabilities that have come out, and how quickly they've taken on board, how they've assessed those and taken those on board and actually mitigated them. And if they haven't, why haven't they? And what was the risk judgment about what they've done in certain circumstances? All of those give you confidence that not only are they doing what they're saying they're doing, they're actually doing it in practice on a day-to-day basis, and they're living this on a day-to-day basis. You can't do that for everyone. You can't do that for every single supplier, which is why it's important to identify those important suppliers who you have that level of cooperative engagement with on a regular basis.
Thank you, Colin. Now, because of the time limitation, we will answer one more question, and the rest of the questions will be answered by email by Mr. Colin accordingly. When speaking to a new client who is implementing ISO 27001, how do you explain what the implementation is trying to accomplish? What are the most important things for the client's employees to understand?
I think that goes back to the initial risk assessment of why they want to do it in the first place. And I think it's important to scope out the services that client is providing to other entities out there in the marketplace, and helping them to understand what it is they're trying to do, what their customer expectations are, and helping them understand the risks they're exposed to and how operating an ISMS within their organization can both mitigate those risks and evidence to their clients that they have controls and processes in place through the long term to manage those risks that they see in those environments. And scoping out by doing a mini risk assessment exercise right up front, exposing the issues of governance, management and control, as well as the technical risk, I think is important to bring on speed with the organization a common understanding of what that 27001 journey will give them and how they can use that to demonstrate to their clients that they are sufficiently secure.
Thank you, Colin, again for this great presentation, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. I would like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website as well as on our YouTube channel, along with the slides of the presentation. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey about the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete it and provide us with your feedback. Also, if you are aware of an interesting topic that you would like to discuss and participants would benefit from, please feel free to write down your suggestions. For more information, visit our website www.pcb.com. Thank you all and have a great day.